Imagine you are a young queen, barely 16, standing in a cold stone hall as the king you've just married stares at you like you're a bad omen. Whispers ripple through the court. They say you're cursed, that your presence will bring famine, war, and death to his bloodline. What does a king do when he believes his bride is a curse? In the Middle Ages, it could mean exile, humiliation, or something far worse. Because when superstition and absolute power meet at the wedding altar, the vows become a sentence, and the punishment can last a lifetime. In medieval Europe, a marriage to a king was supposed to be the height of fortune, but for some brides, it became a prison built of rumor and fear. A royal wedding was more than romance. It was a political gamble, a spiritual contract, and, in some cases, a dangerous experiment in superstition. The idea of the cursed bride could start with something as small as an ill-timed storm, a sudden illness, or a failed harvest in the months before the wedding. When the king's advisors whispered that his bride was to blame, those whispers could turn lethal. After all, what ruler could ignore the possibility that his wife might bring ruin to his kingdom? Some kings saw such omens as signs from God, demanding punishment. Others treated them as political opportunity, an excuse to rid themselves of an unwanted alliance without declaring war. And how better to rid oneself of a bride than to claim she was cursed? Punishments varied. A queen might be locked away in a remote tower, her name erased from court records. She might be forced into humiliating purification rituals, stripped of her jewels, and made to live as a servant in her own palace. In some cases, she was sent back to her family in disgrace, the marriage annulled as if it had never existed. But the most disturbing fates were reserved for the brides the king could not afford to release, women whose dowries, bloodlines, or political importance made them too valuable to discard. For them, life became a slow suffocation under constant surveillance, every smile and word measured for signs of ill fortune, and one such bride, trapped in a marriage steeped in superstition, would face a torment so cruel it became legend. She was brought to the palace at dawn, her gown heavy with pearls, her crown so tight it left marks on her skin. To the watching crowd, she was the picture of grace and fortune, but inside the royal chambers, the whispers had already begun. The queen, they said, had been born under a blood moon. Her mother had died in childbirth, and every man she had been betrothed to before the king had met a violent or sudden death. To a medieval court obsessed with omens, this was enough to make her dangerous. The king, wary but bound by treaty, married her anyway. But from the moment she stepped into his hall, she was watched. Every accident, a dropped goblet, a fainting servant, a sudden thunderstorm was noted and tied to her presence. The king's advisors urged precautions. What does a ruler do when he believes his wife could bring famine or plague? In this court, it meant confinement. Her apartments were moved to the farthest wing of the palace, away from the royal nursery. Servants were ordered to report her every word. She was not to touch the king without a priest present to bless the meeting. And then came the rituals. Clerics insisted she undergo repeated cleansings, fasting for days, bathing in blessed water so cold it numbed her limbs, reciting prayers until her voice cracked. The people were told these were acts of devotion. In truth, they were tests meant to see if the curse could be broken. When a poor harvest struck that year, the whispers became shouts. The king, under pressure from both nobles and priests, staged a public atonement. She was paraded barefoot through the streets, wearing only a linen shift, her hair unbound, the medieval symbol of shame. Citizens were encouraged to throw grain at her, to feed the curse until it was satisfied. And yet, the treaty that brought her to this palace meant she could not be divorced or executed without risking war. So she remained, neither wife nor widow, trapped in a gilded cage, where every breath was monitored for signs of ill fortune. But hers was not the only fate shaped by superstition. In another kingdom, a king's fear of a cursed bride led to a punishment, even crueler one that blurred the line between marriage and imprisonment, and turned a queen's wedding chamber into her cell. The wedding had been arranged in haste, a political alliance sealed with ink, before either bride or groom had seen the other's face. She arrived at the castle gates under a sky the color of ash, and the moment the king looked at her, he believed the omens were true. Her eyes, he said, were too pale, her skin like the dead, and her silence during the ceremony was taken as proof that she carried a shadow into his kingdom. In a medieval world where kings believed the health of their reign was tied to the purity of their queen, superstition was not just paranoia, it was policy. And this king's policy was swift. His new bride was to live in seclusion, not for a week or a month, but indefinitely. Her wedding chamber was a small stone room at the top of a tower, its windows covered with iron bars. She was allowed to see the king only on certain feast days, always in the presence of priests chanting protective psalms. Even then, he would not touch her without wearing gloves, convinced that her skin might carry a curse that could pass into his blood. The rules of her life were strict and humiliating. She could not eat food prepared by her own servants. Everything had to be blessed, tasted, and declared safe. She could not speak to foreign envoys, for fear her words might infect alliances, and she was forbidden from entering the royal chapel, as if her presence might poison the prayers. Loneliness was her constant companion. Her ladies-in-waiting were rotated weekly, so no one could grow loyal to her. Letters she wrote to her family were never delivered, replaced with carefully edited versions that reassured them of her comfort. In truth, she was a prisoner with a crown. And then came the nightly ritual. Before sunset, the king's guard would visit her chamber and hang a wreath of dried herbs over the door. Wormwood, sage, and juniper, the medieval shield against evil spirits. A basin of holy water was placed inside, and she was ordered to dip her hands in it before sleeping. What does it do to a person when their very body is treated as a plague? Months turned to years. She became a ghost in her own court, known only through rumors, the cursed queen in the tower, the bride who never left her chamber. Some whispered she had grown so pale she could no longer stand sunlight. Others claimed she could summon storms with a glance, an invention of gossip, but one that only deepened her isolation. And yet, she never broke. She learned the rhythm of her confinement, found small rebellions refusing to eat the blessed bread, or quietly refusing to recite the prayers meant to purify her. If she was cursed, she would not spend her life proving otherwise. But her defiance brought new punishment. The king ordered her chamber stripped of its few comforts. No tapestries on the walls, no books, no music, only bare stone, the constant wind through the bars, and the cold echo of her own breath. Still, the alliance held. The king got what he wanted politically, and the queen, though silenced, became a living warning to all who entered the court. Cross the king, and your fate could be sealed in stone. But far from this fortress, another bride would learn that being labeled cursed didn't just mean isolation, it could mean being made the centerpiece of a public spectacle. And her punishment would turn her wedding day into the most humiliating performance the medieval world had ever seen. Her wedding day should have been the beginning of her reign instead. It became the stage for her humiliation. The king, a man both deeply superstitious and endlessly theatrical, believed his bride carried a curse that could only be burned away through a public ritual, and if the ritual humiliated her in front of his court, all the better. It began with a whisper campaign weeks before the ceremony. Priests and astrologers were summoned to investigate the omens surrounding her birth. They declared that the stars had been in ill alignment, that she had been born on the feast of the unclean, and that her mother's death in childbirth was proof of a tainted womb. None of this was fact, but in the medieval world, perception was more powerful than truth. On the morning of the wedding, the king ordered a change to tradition. Instead of arriving in the bridal litter draped in silks, she was made to walk the final stretch to the cathedral barefoot, her train carried not by noble ladies, but by peasants dressed as mourners. The message was clear. This was not a joyous union, but a dangerous gamble. Inside the cathedral, the air was heavy with incense. Before the vows, the bride was ordered to kneel before a great brazier. A priest waved bundles of burning herbs over her head, wormwood, rue, and sage, the smoke of cleansing. The king watched from his throne, smiling slightly, as the smoke made her eyes water and her skin prickle. But the true humiliation came after the vows. Instead of leading her to the banquet, the king led her to the courtyard, where a crowd of nobles and commoners waited. There, a raised platform had been built, and at its center, a chair carved to look like a pyre. She was made to sit in it while court musicians played a slow, mocking tune. One by one, members of the court approached and tossed symbolic offerings into the brazier at her feet, grain to feed the curse, salt to purify her, and scraps of black cloth to bind the evil within her. Every gesture, every laugh from the crowd, chipped away at her dignity. And yet, the ritual did not end there. The king declared that for the first 7 nights of their marriage, the queen would dine not in the royal hall, but in the public square seated alone at a table while citizens were encouraged to pray the curse away by watching her eat. Imagine being watched by hundreds of eyes as you lift each bite, every movement weighed with superstition. By the 3rd night, the crowds grew rowdier. Some threw crumbs at her feet, others whispered blessings or insults as they passed. A few knelt as if she were a saint, while others spat in the dust near her chair. In a medieval society obsessed with signs and symbols, every reaction became another layer to the story of the cursed bride. Why did the king go to such lengths? Part of it was fear, a belief that public rituals could contain a curse. But part of it was politics. By turning his bride's supposed curse into a spectacle, he kept his nobles distracted, his enemies mocked, and himself cast as a ruler bold enough to tame misfortune. The queen endured it in silence. She never wept, never spoke, never allowed the court the satisfaction of seeing her break. That stoicism, ironically, became its own legend, and in whispers, the people began to call her the Stone Queen, unshakable in the face of shame. But legends have their own dangers. The more her defiance was admired, the more the king sought to crush it. On the 8th night, the public meals ended, and the queen vanished from view entirely. Her apartments were sealed, her ladies dismissed, and for months, no one knew if she was alive. Some said she had been sent to a distant convent, forced to take vows as penance for her ill-starred birth. Others claimed she still lived in the palace, hidden away in a wing so remote that even servants feared to go there. The truth was locked behind the same stone walls that had first crowned her in smoke and shame. And yet, her story would not die. Years later, in another kingdom, a cursed bride would face an even darker fate. Not public humiliation, not isolation, but a punishment meant to erase her entirely. Because if a king believed the curse could not be broken, there was always one final way to ensure it could never touch him again. The crown glittered, the crowd cheered, and yet, behind the veil, the bride's hands were shaking, not from nerves, but from fear. The king she was about to marry believed she carried a curse, and in the Middle Ages, that belief could be more dangerous than any blade. A cursed bride wasn't just unloved. She was a threat to the throne, to the kingdom, to the king's very soul. What happens when the most powerful man in the realm thinks your touch can ruin him? In this world, love was never the antidote. It was often the executioner. When a king decided a curse could not be broken, he did not argue with fate, he tried to erase it. The goal was simple: make the bride disappear without starting a war, without provoking the church, without leaving a stain on the royal line. How do you unmake a queen without unmaking your crown? In the Middle Ages, there were methods cold, legal, and devastating. The first was administrative annihilation. Scribes were ordered to redraw the royal ledgers, striking her name from feast lists, travel rolls, and court stipends. Portraits were rehung with placards that read simply, "The Consort," as if a title could swallow a person whole. What happens to a life when parchment decides it never existed? Then came ritual distance. The queen's seal was seized. Her ring, blamed as a conduit of misfortune, was locked in a reliquary and paraded like a captured serpent. Priests were told to pray for a wife who brings grace, a phrase that blessed the king while cursing the bride without saying her name. In sermons, misfortune was traced to an unnamed shadow, and everyone knew who the shadow was. Some kings preferred geography as a weapon. A sealed carriage at daybreak, a road no herald would announce, a convent that doubled as a vault. The letter dispatching her called it retreat or health. words that sounded kind until the convent door closed like a verdict. There, the queen was not forced into a new faith. She was draped in it, a veil, a rule, a silence that turned months into fog. Is a prison still a prison if it smells of incense and is signed by a bishop? For queens whose dowries were too valuable to discard, kings engineered legal fog. Councils convened to examine omens. A stillborn calf, a cracked chalice, a comet smearing the night. Advisors called it prudence. The queen called it trial without defense. Astrologers were summoned to chart the sky of her birth, retroactively convicting her with stars. If the verdict leaned toward exile, annulment papers appeared like lightning, not for sin, but for defect of fortune, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. The most chilling strategy was substitution by spectacle. A new bride, purified by processions and prophecy, was brought to court before the old one had a chance to speak. Minstrels composed songs about blessings restored. The chorus buried the woman who still lived. The cursed queen remained in a side wing, fed on soft bread and softer lies, while the palace applauded the solution. What louder prayer is there than applause? Erasure also worked by inheritance. If the king feared tainted heirs, he ordered doctors to observe the queen's body, not with blades, but with rules. No visits after dusk, no feasts on fertile days, no touch without a priest. Months passed with no conception. The failure he engineered became the proof he needed. Sympathy shifted from the unseen woman to the very visible crown. The king deserves a future. Sometimes the queen resisted tiny rebellions that glowed like embers. She signed her name on linens meant for the poor, seeding the city with her signature. She slipped coins to messengers who smuggled letters past the palace gates, letters that began, "I am still here." How much hope can one line of ink hold? Enough to frighten a court that depended on silence. In response, the king tightened the circle. New guards, old servants, dismissed, the chapel door locked during evening prayers, and yet, erasure carried risks. A vanished queen breeds rumors. Rumors breed saints. In markets, storytellers turned her into the Lady of the Locked Tower, a figure who blessed infants and stilled storms in the stories of those who needed mercy more than facts. Kings feared nothing more than a legend with a face, so they sent official histories to drown the songs, chronicles where misfortune had no woman's name, only the season of troubles. Can a book outshout a lullaby? The crown bet that it could. In rare moments, alliances snapped. A queen's kin might arrive with letters of safe conduct and soldiers at their backs, demanding audience. Then the king practiced the art of the gentle lie. She was ill. She was meditating. She had chosen devotion over diamonds. The family left with perfumed assurances and no proof. The queen remained, a rumor wrapped in velvet. Not every erasure was complete. Some queens learned to haunt their own palaces, stepping into galleries at hours when corridors were empty, standing at windows where only the moon could witness. Servants swore they saw a pale figure touch the cold glass and leave no breath upon it, as if even the pain refused to remember her. What kind of curse is memory itself? When it survives, what power tries to kill? And still the machinery turned, new festivals to celebrate a cleansed reign, new laws to codify a pure succession. Each proclamation was a brick in the wall meant to outlast the woman it walled in. But bricks remember pressure, and walls remember names. A century later, a clerk copying an old roll found a space where a queen's title should have been a gap like a gasp, and wrote in the margin, "A lady once reigned here, because you can rub out ink, exile a body, and drown a voice. But you cannot convince time that nothing happened." And for kings who built their thrones on superstition, time was the one chronicler they could not bribe. But what happens when erasure fails? When a king's fear turns from quiet paperwork to loud punishment? In some realms, the answer was trial by omen, a spectacle that blended courtroom and carnival, where the sky itself was called to testify. When exile wasn't enough, kings turned to something far more dangerous, the theater of judgment. The trial by omen. Part courtroom, part prophecy, all performance. It began with a public summons, a declaration loud enough to wake fear in every house. By royal command, the queen's fate shall be tested before God and man. The words were a sentence before the trial even began, because who survives when heaven itself is called to judge? She was placed on a raised platform, not in jewels, not in silk, but in plain white linen, the color of innocence twisted into a backdrop for guilt. Around her, astrologers unfolded star charts. Bowls of colored water shimmered in the sun. Brass astrolabes caught the light. Even before the first test, the stage was already whispering, "She will fall." The candle test came first. A single flame burned beside her. If it bent toward her, they said the curse was pulling divine light. If it bent away, they claimed heaven recoiled. Either way, the verdict was sealed. Next was the bread trial. A loaf infused with truth herbs was set before her. She must cut it, eat it, swallow it whole. If she coughed, guilty. If she hesitated, guilty. When even a breath could condemn you, the outcome was never in doubt. Then the bird flight judgment, a cage of white doves thrown open. If they scattered, the curse chased them. If they circled, the curse held them. Every flutter, every wingbeat twisted into proof, because the trial wasn't about finding truth. It was about proving the king right. The crowd gasped at every shift of wind, every flicker of light. Every movement became a sign. This wasn't justice. This was theater. The gentlest sentence was confinement in a blessing house, a palace wing turned into a chapel. No fresh air, no laughter, only incense, prayers, and walls that hummed with chants. The harsher fate, becoming a living warning. One queen was made to sit in the throne room during all audiences, always in white, always silent. Visitors were told to pass her before speaking to the king, to feel misfortune in their bones. She became furniture, a breathing ghost. Why not just send her away? Because a private exile sends a quiet message. A public trial says, "I command even the will of heaven," and that was the real prize. But here's what kings forgot: theater creates witnesses. People remembered when the candle bent the wrong way, when the birds landed on her shoulder, tiny cracks in the story that refused to die. In one legend, a queen failed every test in the king's eyes, yet the people saw her as blessed. Her name became a prayer. Mothers whispered it in childbirth. Farmers carved it into doorframes for luck. The king had tried to bury her in shame and made her immortal instead. But not every cursed bride was given this public theater. Some punishments happened far from the square, behind walls that no one could enter. And when a king's fear moves from the light into the shadows, the cruelty changes. It stops being about humiliation. It becomes about erasure, and that is where the real horror begins. When the crowd was gone, when the candles burned low, when the king no longer needed theater, that's when the real punishments began. Because in the shadows, there were no witnesses, no murmurs of doubt, only the king, his fear, and the woman he believed could destroy him with a single breath. For some brides, it began with a quiet knock. A servant, pale, trembling. "His Majesty requests your presence. Now." The corridors were empty, the air colder. The doors they passed were locked, and with each step, the palace stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a trap. There were rooms no one spoke of. Narrow, windowless chambers deep inside the castle's oldest walls. They weren't cells. They were coffins you could walk into. A bed, a single candle, a small slot in the wall where a tray could be pushed through. Here, the king could keep a bride alive without letting her live. No court appearances, no letters, no visitors. The curse, he believed, could not spread if it could not move. Sometimes it wasn't even a prison, it was a place disguised as a sanctuary, a private chapel, a healing retreat. But the only prayer heard there was silence. Servants assigned to guard these women were chosen for their loyalty, and for something else, their ability to forget. In one whispered tale, a cursed bride was locked in a tower with mirrors on every wall. The king claimed it was to watch for the moment the curse revealed itself. Day after day, she was forced to look at herself until her reflection no longer felt human. Another story tells of a queen who was moved from room to room every few nights, never the same bed twice, never the same window view. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was disorientation. Break her sense of time, break her sense of place, break her entirely. Some kings went further still. If they couldn't destroy the curse, they would destroy the story. Erase her name from records, burn her portraits, seal her rooms. It was as if she had never existed. But the more they tried to erase, the more the whispers grew. Servants told of faint singing heard through stone. Stable boys swore they saw a pale hand in a high window, waving once before disappearing. The less the people knew, the more they imagined, and imagination is a curse no king can control. Why did these shadow punishments happen at all? Because public trials risked sympathy. Private punishment left only fear, and fear, in a king's mind, was safer than pity. There's one account, half legend, half truth, of a cursed bride who escaped such a shadow prison. She didn't run to another kingdom. She didn't hide. She walked straight into the marketplace, veil lifted, eyes unblinking. The crowd froze. Some believed they'd seen a ghost. Others knelt, believing she had returned blessed, not cursed. The king tried to have her seized, but the moment had already broken him. You can command the guards. You cannot command what people choose to believe. That's the paradox at the heart of these horrors. The harder a king fought a curse, the more real it became. And in some cases, the curse wasn't the woman at all, it was the fear she put in him. Because when a ruler believes in shadows, he starts living in them. And sometimes, the only way out of the shadows is to create a darker one for someone else. It wasn't just legend. It happened, and the records still whisper her name. In 1462, Isabella of Portugal married King John II of Castile. By all accounts, she was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. But independence in a queen could be mistaken for something else, a curse, especially when fortune turned sour. When the kingdom faced crop failures and plague, the court began to murmur. The king had taken a wife who had brought bad luck to the land. And for a ruler desperate to prove he held heaven's favor, that was a dangerous rumor to ignore. At first, the punishments were small. A cancelled feast here, a public slight there. She was made to stand at ceremonies without being addressed. It was the slow kind of humiliation, the kind that strips a person layer by layer until there's nothing left but silence. Then came the omens, a comet spotted in the night sky, a sudden storm during a royal procession, a priest claiming that his holy water boiled in her presence. Each sign added another stone to the wall being built around her life. Isabella was eventually moved to a private residence under the guise of protection. In reality, it was a gilded prison. No court appearances, no letters without approval. Her ladies-in-waiting replaced by watchers. The excuse was always the same for the safety of the realm. Months turned to years. Isabella's name was scrubbed from official speeches, her likeness removed from paintings. And yet, she was still there, breathing, waiting, watching the king grow old and the whispers grow louder. Because while John tried to erase her, the people turned her into something else, a figure of pity, and eventually, quiet defiance. Merchants swore their trade prospered when they saw her face in dreams. Mothers told their daughters that the queen had been wronged by the king but blessed by God. And when John died, the cursed queen walked freely again, not as a ruler, but as a survivor. In the end, the curse hadn't been hers at all. It had been his, the fear that ruled him more than any crown. And if one king could be brought to his knees by superstition, how many others could fall the same way? That question haunted courts for centuries. But not all kings waited for omens. Some created them twisted theater to make sure the curse became real, even if they had to invent it. Some kings didn't wait for curses to appear, they built them. Because if a curse didn't exist, it could be made a story planted in the right ears, an omen staged in the right place. Fear is powerful. Manufactured fear is unstoppable. It began with whispers. A servant claiming the queen's shadow moved differently. A guard insisting her reflection lagged in the mirror, ridiculous on the surface. but deadly in a world where superstition ruled over reason. Next came the signs. A dead bird placed outside her chambers, a chalice cracked by unseen hands, a candle snuffed in a chapel with no wind. Every moment staged, every witness chosen. And the king, he played the role of reluctant believer. I do not wish to accuse my bride, but I cannot ignore what I have seen. The crowd leaned in. The story spread like smoke in dry air. Once the court believed the curse was real, the rest was easy. The bride could be isolated, stripped of title, even executed, all under the guise of protecting the kingdom. It wasn't punishment, it was mercy. One infamous case told of a queen accused of breathing frost into the king's chambers. The frost was just salt scattered overnight, but it was enough. She was banished to a monastery, forbidden to speak to anyone under threat of death. These manufactured curses weren't just about removing a queen. They were about sending a message. No one, not even a royal bride, was beyond the king's reach. And that's why the legend of the cursed bride has lasted so long. Because it was never truly about magic. It was about power. Power to isolate. Power to erase. Power to turn love into a weapon. In the end, the curse was rarely on the bride at all. It was on the man who believed his crown could protect him from shadows, only to be swallowed by them in the end.